Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
With just 7 months to go before the UK leaves the European Union, the government has moved to allay fears over the consequences of no deal being reached with Brussels on future trading arrangements. It's released a raft of papers offering advice to businesses and individuals and sets out the government's preparations for any impact. The Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab says while no agreement with Brussels is unlikely, ministers have a responsibility to plan for all outcomes. Well, the 24 documents cover a wide range of potential concerns. Consumers would face slower and more costly credit card payments buying EU products, and British citizens living abroad could lose access to their bank accounts. Businesses exporting to Europe may have to renegotiate contracts to reflect customs and tariff changes and hire additional expert staff. And new medicines coming into the UK will have to be checked as drug companies are told to boost stockpiles here. But there was little in the papers on the deeply contentious issue of trade across the border with Northern Ireland. British firms are told to seek the advice of the Irish government. Well, we'll be analysing what the documents suggest a no deal could mean for you with our specialist editors. But first, here's our deputy political editor, John Pienaar.
For millions of Brits, a Brexit deal would mean change, but no deal could mean more and quickly. Card spending in Europe more costly. No guarantee Brits could use EU bank accounts the same way or draw pensions. Medicines, they'd be stockpiled, but no promise they wouldn't run out. And as for business, traders would face new customs duties and safety checks and bureaucracy at a stroke. The Brexit Secretary's message, no need to panic. The UK had to be ready for anything.
We're raising this issue with the EU to impress upon them our joint responsibility to work together to minimise any harm to UK and European citizens and businesses. Those lives, those livelihoods on both sides should be put ahead of any narrow political interests.
A Brexiteer to his fingertips, he was keen no one swallowed any scare stories, like a hit to the British sandwich.
Contrary to one of the wilder claims, you will still be able to enjoy a BLT after Brexit, and there are no plans to deploy the army to maintain food supplies.
Maybe so, but there'd be sudden change and costs for many. No more EU cap on charges for card spending. Access to bank accounts and pensions could change, and businesses could face increased costs and slower processing times for EU transactions. Worried about medicines, a British agency would take over regulation and assessment in the UK. Some medicines were being stockpiled, but shortages couldn't be wholly ruled out. And for British exporters, no deal would mean big changes. New software to buy, consultants to hire, warehouses. And if you trade with Ireland, where the UK's promised no hard border, Northern Irish businesses are told to ask Ireland for guidance. Do you accept that a no-deal Brexit would leave the country worse off and not better off?
The UK will be better off outside of the EU in any scenario over the long term, but I recognise the risks of the short term, and these technical notices about taking a balanced, sober assessment of that and working out the practical ways to make it work.
Well, some ministers are frankly alarmed at the idea of leaving with no deal. The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has written to a senior colleague today warning that economic growth could take a hit of nearly 8% over 15 years. Brexiteers might call that scaremongering. The Chancellor and his friends would say it's simply facing harsh reality. Few MPs like the idea of a no-deal Brexit, so are opposition parties backing the government? Of course not.
8 weeks before the October summit, which is supposed to be the end of the negotiations, the government is just publishing these vague papers. And they're not even publishing all of them. Presumably, the other 50 or so papers are still being written. That really isn't going to reassure anybody.
The likelihood of a people's vote is now growing when we have a no deal, which is obviously unacceptable and highly disruptive, and we have a government deal which is poor and disruptive. What else do we do?
In Brussels, the EU is playing hardball and saying any kind of Brexit will come at a cost.
It's going to lead to disruption, regardless. So, with a deal or without a deal. And that's why everybody, and in particular economic operators, needs to be prepared.
The agreed time to sketch out Britain's future relationship with the EU has almost run out. Talk of crisis has become a cliché. Expect to hear it again. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as we've been hearing, pharmaceutical companies have been told they must stock up on medicines to cope with a no-deal Brexit. Dominic Raab says there needs to be an additional 6 weeks' supply stored in the UK. A no-deal would also mean all new medical products coming into the country would have to be approved. With his assessment of the government's advice, here's our health editor, Hugh Pym.
There have been fears that supplies of medicines could be held up if there's no deal and there are customs delays at Channel ports. The worry was that essential medication for patients, which has to be imported, might not be available. Hospitals and pharmacies weren't sure whether they should stockpile, but ministers are telling them there won't be a problem. The government has today written to hospital managers and others in the health and care system saying they don't need to worry about building up extra supplies. That will be taken care of. At the same time, doctors have been urged not to sign longer dated prescriptions for patients who might feel they need extra medicines. Ministers have told the pharmaceutical industry to build up 6 weeks' worth of supplies of medicines which are imported from elsewhere in Europe.
Well, the letter to the NHS really is a first step, and I think that hospitals and other organisations throughout the NHS will be expecting more detailed guidance. I mean, these are organisations that are used to emergencies, but this is a pretty unprecedented situation.
If there's no deal, drug companies will have to get new products approved twice, once by British regulators and once by their European counterparts, adding an unwelcome extra layer of bureaucracy. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, what about the impact on business and finance of a no-deal Brexit? Firms have been told future trading with the EU might mean renegotiating contracts with suppliers and customers because of customs and tariff changes. They've also been advised to hire expert help to cope. Here's our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, with his analysis of what a no-deal might mean for business.
The banks and insurance companies of the City of London, a sector that neatly sums up the challenges of a no-deal Brexit. It's a sector that is closely intertwined with the rest of the European Union. It's important economically. And if there were no deal, it would be facing higher trade barriers. And higher trade barriers mean one thing: higher costs. And ultimately, they tend to be passed on to us, the consumer. And just as it did for the financial services sector, the government today outlined the challenges for the food sector. New tariffs, new regulations, described as frightening. A concern shared by many businesses across the economy.
Only a third of IOD members have actually done any really active contingency planning. The rest have been waiting for more information to come out from the government. So I think this is some welcome detail, long overdue. But what we'd like to see more of in the future is what the government plans to do to really mitigate the impact of no deal.
Some firms have welcomed the fact that at least there is now some detail about what the government believes are the possible challenges of red tape, of increased costs, of disruption of a no-deal Brexit. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.
So with the release of the government's advisories, what does a no-deal Brexit mean for ordinary people across the UK? Here's our correspondent Judith Moritz.
Time keeps on ticking towards Brexit Day. 7 months till the 29th of March. But what would a no-deal Brexit look like for you and me? In the event of that happening, it could prove more expensive for Brits to shop within the EU, whether you're going there on holiday or shopping here online. If you use your cards to make a payment, the chances are the bill could go up, because at the moment there's a ban which stops you being stung with a surcharge for using your cards. But that will stop. And if you're receiving a parcel in from the EU, there could be further costs, because goods will no longer be eligible for VAT relief. What if you've decided to escape this weather and move abroad? There are warnings for expats who live in the EU but do their banking or have pensions and financial products in the UK. Under a no-deal scenario, moving their money and getting access to funds will be even harder. Adam Colbeck lives between London and Provence in France.
My concerns would be savings, accessing savings from the UK whilst in France. Would also be using my credit card in France and whether I'm going to be able to do that without being charged. And also the transferring of my wages from my English bank account into my French bank account each month, whether that's still going to be possible. And if it is going to be possible, whether it's going to be more expensive, how much more expensive it might be.
And what about the food on our plates? Well, Dominic Raab says we'll still be able to enjoy a BLT after Brexit. But if the bacon's from Denmark, the tomatoes are Dutch and the lettuce is from Spain, the chances are the cost will go up because of the increase in red tape for food importers. The National Farmers Unions warned of a disastrous cliff-edge scenario for the UK food supply chain. But the Brexit secretary says there'll be no sandwich famine and no need to use the military to keep the shelves stocked. The big question is how likely is a no-deal Brexit? The government says not very, but adds that it's putting its plans in place just in case. Judith Moritz, BBC News.
In a moment, we'll talk to our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar at Westminster. But first, Damien Grammaticus is in Brussels for us this evening. Damien, what's been the reaction to these documents from the folk where you are?
Well, Clive, here what they say is they've been producing their own documents like this for nearly a year now, because they say that absolutely clearly Brexit will have impacts as an automatic operation of the UK leaving the EU's customs union, single market, its legal structures. And they've been warning for a long time that companies and individuals need to face up to that. Now, the UK approach is built on a couple of things. It seems to be, on the one hand, saying it would hope for reciprocation from the EU. On the other hand, on things like banks trying to sell services into the EU, well, companies would just have to follow EU rules. Now, the EU side say that they are negotiating only for a withdrawal agreement to settle all of those issues. They will not have, they say, separate negotiations for no deal. And their notices make clear that they will, in the case of no deal, treat the UK as a third country. Very little scope for any special deals. One other thing I think they will have noticed here today, Dominic Raab saying these were being produced because the EU might not match the UK's ambition and pragmatism, and there might be no deal because of that. That will sound here like a sort of blame game, and they have already said this week the negotiators will not be moved by any sort of attempt to blame them.
Damien, thank you for that. Damien Grammaticus there in Brussels. Let's talk to John Pienaar at Westminster. John, the government is confident it can reach a deal within the time frame, but it looks as if this could go right down to the wire.
Absolutely. I mean, you couldn't call this a particularly comfortable moment for Dominic Raab. He campaigned for leave. He's a true believer. Yet there he was today, setting out plans to deal with a failure to get the kind of deal that Brexiteers said at the start would be easy to accomplish. He's also been saying today that a deal with the EU was within sight. Well, maybe so, but Calais is within sight of Dover, and the political gap between the two sides may turn out to be unbridgeable. Now, to Dominic Raab and those who agree with them, it seems common sense that there will be a deal in the end. In the end, the former Remainers and those who have deep doubts about this, they see the cost and disruption that could go with Brexit as national harm. The other side see it as bumps in the road on the way to a better future. Dominic Raab could be a more comfortable colleague for Theresa May than his predecessor David Davis. You could say his confidence in getting a deal, or maybe cooperation if there's no deal, that is about his faith. You could also say it's about wishful thinking.
OK, John, thank you for that. John Pienaar there at Westminster. And again, Damien, thank you. Damien Grammaticus there in Brussels.
Now, the government's contingency plans for a no-deal Brexit amount to a torrent of details, from stockpiles of medical supplies to warnings that Britons living elsewhere in Europe could lose access to UK banking and pension services. Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab described it as practical and proportionate advice. But Labour said it showed a no-deal scenario would be catastrophic. In a moment, we'll be discussing what impact this could have on our daily lives. But first, over to our political correspondent, Michael Crick in Westminster. Michael.
Well, Matt, if you went along to Dominic Raab's presentation today, you might be left thinking that no deal really wouldn't be that much of a problem. The government can cope with it. But not long after the presentation came two big government announcements which suggest that no deal could be a very big problem indeed. First, the Chancellor chose today of all days to announce that no deal would have large fiscal consequences. And he revealed there is Treasury research going on which is likely to suggest that the consequences of no deal could be even worse than he suggested in the last analysis in January. Second, the Health Secretary told the pharmaceutical industry it should stockpile another 6 weeks of drugs to cope with possible disruption from Europe.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming.
Don't worry was the message the Brexit Secretary tried to give us. We don't expect no deal, Dominic Raab said, but if it happens, we're prepared and there's no need to panic, he implied.
But let me be clear about this. It is not what we want and it's not what we expect. But we must be ready. We have a duty as a responsible government to plan for every eventuality.
Mr Raab, a Brexiteer, insisted he doesn't want no deal, but he did list some benefits.
The immediate recovery of full legislative and regulatory control, including over immigration policy. The unfettered ability to lower tariffs to bring into effect new free trade deals that we negotiate straight away. And mindful of our strict legal obligations, a swifter end to our financial contributions to the EU.
But Mr Raab's big day was rather spoilt by the Chancellor announcing he expects new Treasury research to show no deal would do even more harm to the economy than he previously thought. Philip Hammond wrote to the chair of the Commons Treasury Committee, telling her the Treasury is refining its January analysis, which suggested government borrowing would be £80 billion higher in 15 years' time. Now the effects are likely to be worse, Mr Hammond said. We expect the analysis to show that for scenarios in which we would have higher barriers to trade with the EU, there will be a more damaging effect on the economy and public finances. Dominic Raab's papers on no deal today confirm extra red tape and higher costs for businesses trading with the EU. And the public should expect higher charges on card payments within the European Union. The pharmaceutical industry has long warned medicine supplies would be at severe risk under no deal. But Mr Raab's papers today left them reassured.
This is a good day for patients. Patients can feel confident that the government and the industry are working well together to put plans in place to make sure that we can continue to supply their medicines to them.
Strangely, Mr Raab's documents fail to say that ministers now want the pharma industry to stockpile a lot more medicines. That news only came later when the Health Secretary Matt Hancock wrote to pharmaceutical firms warning no deal might disrupt EU imports and they should acquire another 6 weeks' supplies, largely at their expense. As for stockpiling food, that's just a scare story, Dominic Raab said. But the industry thinks no deal would still mean disruption.
Real concern that we have and our members have is how can all that has to be done in the time available. Things like registering as approved economic operators, understanding the new customs system, all of that stuff is really difficult. And we've only got 6 months to do it, and we haven't even been told yet how these systems will work. So time is against us, we need information, and we're running out of the time in order to put it into effect.
I thought the proposals were bland, thin on detail, thin on substance, and I don't think they're going to reassure anybody. This appears to me to be a government in denial about the serious consequences of no deal.
Whether it's
today was just the government's first batch of no deal advisory papers.
Thank you very much.
They'll release another 60 next month.
And Michael, what's this about some prominent UKIPers joining the Tory party?
Yes, Aaron Banks, one of UKIP's biggest funders, and his sidekick Andy Wigmore have both announced today that they've joined the Conservative Party. Now, this will stoke the fears of those in the party who are saying that the party is susceptible to infiltration from thousands of UKIP members, perhaps people with the intention of getting somebody like Boris Johnson elected as the next Conservative leader. Now, there are reports tonight that the Conservatives have actually blocked their applications, but Banks and Wigmore say that they've had a very nice letter saying that their membership has been activated. So another problem for Theresa May.
Michael, thanks very much. Fatima.
Thanks, Matt. Well, our business correspondent Helia Ibrahimi has been going through the government's 25 documents to find out what impact their plans could have for British industry, especially sectors like financial services. She takes a look at the doomsday scenario.
The City of London is a ghost town. The realities of Brexit are starting to sink in. Without a deal, many UK financial services will no longer be legal in Europe. People, licences and regulatory capital will have to leave. $26 trillion of financial contracts could be marked invalid. And for consumers, tens of millions of insurance contracts and pension plans could fail to pay out. While today the government said it would pretty much unilaterally grant European firms business as usual extensions in the case of a no-deal Brexit, no such assurance has been offered by the EU. That leaves all EU residents, whether European or British, with huge problems when it comes to cashing in insurance policies or their savings. Without agreement from EU regulators, pensioners are one group at risk.
Whether you're UK or an EU citizen, if you're receiving a payment from the UK into the EU through a pension contract, there's uncertainty over the legality of that. And we need that uncertainty removed so insurers don't have to face choosing between breaking their promise and breaking the law.
This is the paradox of choice facing consumers and companies as the prospect of a no-deal Brexit becomes ever more real.
Well, Helia is with me now. Who does it all affect?
Well, it's the whole financial plumbing that underpins the day-to-day lives of companies, of households, that has a giant no-deal spanner in it. Now, today the UK government tried to alleviate some of that, granting European companies extensions. So, for example, Fatima, if you had a home insurance policy with Allianz and you had a fire, under the rules created by the government today, you could cash in that policy, no problems. The issues arise if you're an European resident and you're trying to access a UK product, whether that's an annuity or an insurance product. By next March, that could be illegal. And to give you some context, there could be as many as 38 million insurance products alone like that.
Is it just insurance?
No, it's the whole gamut of financial services, from the very large to the very small. But just to pick out one more consumer issue highlighted by today's report, it's credit cards. Now, in a no-deal scenario, we won't be protected by something called the surcharging ban. So transactions that UK credit cards have in the continent could become more expensive, whether by pennies or by pounds. It illustrates the kind of problems that we might see. Now, before anyone accuses me of scaremongering, it's worth saying that within the city and even within Treasury, there's a belief that in the 11th hour an arrangement will be found, whether that's a no-deal deal that will help alleviate some of these issues for the consumers. But in the end, it needs political will in Europe to make that happen.
Helia, thanks very much. Nat.
Thanks, Fatima. Well, joining me now are Ali Renison, who's Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors, Neil Dixon, Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation and co-chair of the Brexit Health Alliance, and Martin Howe, QC from Lawyers for Britain. Welcome to all of you for coming on the programme. We've got a lot to rattle through, so let's start rattling. Neil Dixon, over to you first. Can you reassure a potential patient that if there is a no-deal Brexit, or rather, are you reassured that that patient will get the same treatment in a year's time as he would do today?
Well, I think we can be a little more assured than we were yesterday, because it is clear that the government is starting to take this seriously. It's recognised that it's all very well to hope for the best, but you've got to start planning for the worst. And that, in a sense, is what the first step has involved today. And the decision, for example, to ask pharmaceutical companies to plan were 6 months of stockpiling, to ask also that where drugs are perishable or they've got short shelf lives, that they should arrange air freight, because the first problem that is going to face us with a no-deal Brexit is around the borders and passing through those borders in the days and weeks after that decision. So I think it is right. The government is taking some steps. In answer to your question, am I totally reassured? I think the answer is not at this stage, though I don't think there is any reason for patients to panic or get anxious at this moment. I think in time this will be sorted, but the government is starting quite late in the day, and I think doing some of this stuff in the time that we've got will be a challenge.
But briefly, things like insulin, for instance, there were quite a few stories about that. There won't be enough insulin for people who suffer from diabetes. Are you reassured on that front, for instance?
Well, I think that what the government has done is identify every single medicine where we are dependent to some degree or other on imports from Europe, and has looked into the vulnerabilities in each area, is talking to the manufacturers about making sure that there are the right levels of stockpiling. I mean, that is exactly what should have happened and is now happening. So to that extent, I think we can be reassured. But of course, some of the detail still needs to be followed up. And I think our members in hospitals, for example, all around the country, they want some more operational detail, I think, to support them, because although they're very used to dealing with emergencies, this is a really challenging and difficult and unprecedented set of circumstances.
Okay. Ali Renison, are you reassured? You represent companies, Institute of Directors. Has enough been said to you to reassure you?
Well, it is a belated first step. It would have been helpful to have this much earlier on in the game, because I think what it in some ways sends a message, even if indirectly, to a lot of businesses, is that it's being put out this late because no deal looks imminent. And I think if it had been done earlier, that would have been avoided. Having said that, it's certainly a welcome, if belated, first step. And the big question will be what's coming in the next set of tranches, because there's quite a bit missing, whether it was on citizens' rights, enforcement of other related contracts. So all eyes will be on the next tranche, very much so.
But quite a bit missing could also be really quite existential for quite a few businesses, couldn't it?
Yeah, and I think that, there were three things we were looking for from today. One was information about how rules would change, and I think the government did a very good job of that, explaining how trade currently flows with the EU and how it would change once third country rules are applied. Secondly, what steps business should be taking now. And thirdly, what unilateral action it would take to mitigate the impact of no deal. And I think what we are still looking for, there was a lot of information on the pharmaceutical front, but when it comes to particularly the areas that the government can control on imports, we would have liked to have seen around VAT and customs within the constraints of international trade rules, what more mitigating action the government would be taking under a no-deal scenario to reduce the impact.
Martin, now let's turn to you. You've written a long article where you said actually we should embrace no deal because we'd be better off in a no-deal Brexit than under the Chequers proposal. Tell us about oranges.
OK, well, at the moment, oranges face a 16% tariff when they're imported from outside the European Union. And this is a symptom of the structure of tariffs that has really existed ever since we first joined the common market in 1972. Basically, there are very high tariffs on areas that protect continental farming interests, German manufacturers, the Italian clothing industry. All these are areas of high tariffs. Now, the effect of having a high tariff on, in this case, the example is oranges, is, of course, that we pay above the world price, that is, British consumers pay above the world price for oranges, and if we import competing oranges from Florida or wherever, they have to pay the tariff.
Right.
So one of the things that we can do when we leave is immediately get rid of tariffs on goods where we have no domestic growers or producers.
Okay.
Oranges is an example.
So we might be able to buy cheaper oranges, but what about exporting to the European Union? And what about credit card transactions, VAT on parcels, pensions not being guaranteed in the way that they are right now? This is pretty big stuff, bigger than oranges, arguably.
Well, oranges, of course, is just one tiny example. Actually, the effect is pretty vast. Because if we pursue a sensible tariff policy, we would be able to cut the costs of our imports on goods across the board by a very considerable level. And you're looking at savings in the many billions of pounds a year for British consumers. Now, you asked about exports into the EU. Of course, that's the opposite direction. The European Union would naturally, in fact, it's required by WTO rules, to impose the same tariffs on imports from the UK as it does from the rest of the world.
Right.
But studies have been done on how much that would be, and it's around 5 billion a year.
All right.
Which our exporters pay. It's under half our current net budget contribution, so it's not a big deal.
All right, just one on the brief front to you. The Chancellor's prediction were pretty dire today, even worse than his previous predictions. 80 billion extra pounds in borrowing, a stagnant economy for 15 years. Do you dismiss those proclamations?
Well, I'm not. Okay, I'm not an economist, so I mean I don't necessarily want to get into the economic debate. But what I would say is the Treasury has consistently produced a series of studies which have purported to demonstrate it's all a disaster if we leave. This is more of the same pattern.
Okay.
And interestingly, one of the problems was they fed in an assumption in their original studies, which was that we would gratuitously impose huge import tariffs, which we don't need to do.
All right. I'm afraid the clock really is against us. So much more to discuss, no time to do it. Ali Renison, Neil Dixon, Martin Howe, thank you very much indeed.
The vision presented today by the government of the UK after a no-deal Brexit could fairly be described as contingency planning. But the detail on potential extra costs and inconvenience to the public and to business made the documents rather more than that. They were a clear warning of the risks of not reaching a deal, putting pressure perhaps on the EU and certainly making clear why the government itself still considers no deal a last resort. Unlikely, the Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab called it today. People who used credit cards in Europe or who are retired and receive British pensions there could be hit hard. Mr Raab tried to play down the impact, but later the Chancellor Philip Hammond warned of big consequences for a no deal.
At last, a plan for what happens if we crash out of the EU next year without a deal, and what it really would mean for different sectors of the economy. Rather late in the day, you might think, but the Brexit Secretary said it had to be done.
It is not what we want, and it's not what we expect. But we must be ready. We have a duty as a responsible government to plan for every eventuality.
And he dismissed some speculation about what it entailed.
Let me assure you that, contrary to one of the wilder claims, you will still be able to enjoy a BLT after Brexit, and there are no plans to deploy the army to maintain food supplies.
But other aspects will worry some. If there's no deal, all consumers could find their credit card fees go up and transactions take longer to process. Britons living in the EU may also lose access to banking services, pensions and insurance policies. Businesses face a big increase in red tape. The government is advising them to hire more staff to deal with customs checks on all imports and exports. There's been none of this kind of paperwork for the past 40 years. For the NHS, provisions are being made to stockpile medicines for at least 6 weeks. And in the long run, new medicines may have to be approved separately by both the EU and the UK.
Looking at these papers, they're effectively a red tape bonanza that impose all sorts of restrictions on businesses. What would you say to business about the prospect of a no deal?
Yes, of course. In relation to those in the current trading links with the EU, there'll be some extra regulatory changes that they'll need to be advised of. The sensible thing to do is to give practical advice and work with them to make that a success.
There was nothing today on how ports might cope with checking new customs declarations, but what detail there was bad enough, says Labour.
A no-deal Brexit would be catastrophic for our country, for our economy and many other sectors. And I think being casual about the serious consequences of no deal is the wrong way forward.
Small businesses are certainly alarmed.
The risk of a no-deal Brexit has been really laid bare today. It will be a real shock to many small business owners, those who export or import, that they could be facing huge new levels of bureaucracy. And they're simply not prepared. They don't have in-house customs experts like bigger organisations. A cliff edge for them would be a real disaster.
The EU was keen to stress that Brexit wouldn't be pain-free, whatever happened in the negotiations.
We are working constructively to reach a deal. And whilst we are continuously working to this effect, it is also clear that the withdrawal of the UK is going to lead to disruption, regardless. So, with a deal or without a deal.
Thank you very much.
But after today, walking away without any deal looks a pretty uncomfortable option.
The possible credit card charges and difficulties accessing pensions from abroad that Libby just mentioned there aren't the only problems of a no-deal Brexit as outlined today. If you're ordering parcels online worth less than £135, they would no longer be eligible for VAT relief. That might be passed on to customers. Organic farmers could face delays of up to 9 months before they get approved to export to the EU once again. New picture warnings will be needed for cigarette packets. The EU owns the copyright to the current ones. And in an example of just how far EU regulations touch so many aspects of life, last year we imported 3,000 sperm samples from Denmark. New agreements will have to be put in place, meaning possible delays for couples trying to conceive here in the UK. Well, I'm delighted to say that Libby joins me live in the studio. Your package, that bit of an explainer, huge list of challenges from Dominic Raab, but also from the Chancellor.
Yes, well, the Brexit Secretary was trying to sound breezy and upbeat, but when you looked at those 140 pages of warnings, essentially, of what businesses would have to do to prepare for Brexit, it was pretty sobering. Added to that, this afternoon, the Chancellor issued a letter that he had written to the Treasury Select Committee spelling out the fiscal consequences, as he put it, of a no-deal Brexit. And effectively, he was saying that public borrowing could go through the roof. Now, he won't have made many friends within his own party by that intervention. But interestingly today, from Dominic Raab, we never heard that phrase, no deal is better than a bad deal.
So, considering everything, and your day began at that press conference and you interviewed Dominic Raab as well, in your assessment, is a no deal more likely tonight or less likely than it was this morning?
Less likely, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that up till now, our threats of walking away have largely been empty threats because we haven't had a plan. Unlike the EU, they've been preparing documents on this for the best part of a year. This is the first time we've actually produced a plan for what would happen if we just walk away. Secondly, when you look at the details of that plan, it's not something that ministers, particularly Conservative ministers, would really want to inflict on British businesses. And I think thirdly, an interesting fact, Dominic Raab has been in post for 6 weeks. I understand that he has now had more meetings with his EU counterpart, Michel Barnier, in those 6 weeks than his predecessor, David Davis, had in 2 years. I think that does suggest that the pace of negotiations is quickening.
All right, Libby, thank you.
The long national journey towards Brexit reached a milestone today. Government papers were published covering 24 areas of national life and what will happen in them if this country can't agree a divorce deal with the European Union. That would lead to a disorderly or no-deal Brexit next March, something both the British government and the EU, of course, say they will strive to avoid. There have been all sorts of predictions of what it might mean, from sandwiches disappearing in the shops to planes grounded. Today, we got the government's view about what could happen and how to plan for it. And in many ways, it was an expression of hope that things could just carry on much the same. Here's David Grossman.
The clock is ticking. What would no deal mean for you, your business, your job, your family? Today, the first official advice on how we should prepare. In a speech in London today, the Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab insisted no deal was unlikely, undesirable, but at the same time, no disaster.
It is not what we want, and it's not what we expect. But we must be ready. We have a duty as a responsible government to plan for every eventuality. And to do this, we need to have a sensible, responsible and realistic conversation about what a no-deal situation really means in practice.
In 24 areas, the government published its advice. In many cases, it said the UK will continue to recognise EU rules, irrespective of what the EU does. For example, in financial services, the government will allow financial institutions from the EU to continue to operate in the UK for 3 years post a no-deal Brexit. But of course, there's no commitment from the EU to reciprocate for UK firms. In medicines, the UK says it will continue to recognise EU drug testing, again, irrespective of what the EU does.
Now, of course, given that we start from a position of common rules, we would also hope, and I think expect, in good faith between close partners, that the EU would recognise medicines from this country with our regulatory approval. But in the no-deal scenario, we can't guarantee it.
Although Mr Raab reserved the right to diverge from EU rules in time, there is concern we may be reducing the pressure on the EU to agree to a deal. After all, by saying we will continue to accept many EU regulations in the event of no deal, we'll be giving them some of what they want, with nothing guaranteed in return. It's all up to EU politicians.
It depends if they want to take the sensible route or they want to try and score points. That if a politician in another European country might feel that somehow there were a net advantage to their industry in not in the UK being excluded, then it's unhelpful. I mean, all of these issues are capable of having sensible solutions. It just needs people to be prepared to come up with agreed, sensible policies on how we go forward.
But even though the government has told businesses in some areas what they need to do, time is limited. There is much to do.
For example, the technical paper entitled Trading with the EU if there's no Brexit deal gives UK companies quite a to-do list if they want to continue to import goods from the EU. Register for a UK economic operator registration and identification number. Ensure that your contracts and international terms and conditions of service now reflect that you are an importer. Consider how you will submit your import declarations. Perhaps you will need to engage a customs broker, freight forwarder or logistics provider, all at a cost to you. You could of course do these jobs yourself, but first you will have to acquire the necessary software and get the right authorizations from HMRC. And finally, of course, you will have to consult HMRC tariff information and guidance alongside a list of commodity codes to correctly classify your goods with the appropriate tariff rate.
The end of March is so near. The amount of planning and how much change you can actually implement in this time is really quite minimal. So I do feel that we in reality we're optimistic and say we'll work it out. It will all work out, won't it? But by the end of March, that's the harder challenge, I think.
Tonight, in a clearly intentionally disruptive intervention, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, directly contradicted the Brexit Secretary's assertion that the UK would go from strength to strength even in the event of no deal. In a letter to the Treasury Select Committee timed for maximum impact, Mr Hammond warned that no deal could cost the UK between 5 and 10% of GDP. To say the least, it's been a day of mixed messages from the government.
David Grossman there. Well, there was a wealth of detail in today's government papers, and there are many more to follow covering different sectors of the economy. In a moment, we'll dig a little deeper with people from 3 sectors covered by today's papers. First, though, there's a little more detail coming up about the government's advice on the financial sector, medicines and agriculture. The papers involve much going with the flow, allowing trade here on current terms in the hope that the EU might reciprocate. On financial services, it predicts no change for many European retail banking operations in this country. As to the bigger picture, it has soothing words about the joint Bank of England and European Central Bank Technical Working Group. But it warns that the loss of passporting could hit UK firms selling financial products across the Channel. That could affect millions of insurance policies as well as pension payments. And it says the tactic of city firms opening subsidiary offices in European countries won't work with many financial products. On medicines, there's an assurance that we would continue to accept batch testing of human medicines done in certain countries. Radioactive isotopes might have to be flown in to bypass queues at Dover. Separate guidance from the Ministry of Health tells hospitals, GPs and pharmacies stockpiling is not necessary. By them anyway, the pharma companies have been directed to ensure supplies. When it comes to farming, exporters of organic produce will face particular hurdles. From having to change packaging to getting certification, there'll be differences. UK control bodies are not permitted to make these applications until the UK becomes a third country, says the note. In other words, people can't even start that process until next March. Well, joining us now to discuss those issues are John De Beer from the Association of British Insurers, Mike Thompson, CEO of the Association of British the Pharmaceutical Industry, I beg your pardon, and Helen Browning, joining us down the line, an organic farmer and CEO of the Soil Association charity. Mike Thompson, if I can start with you, 218 days to go. Doable, do you think, from your point of view, farmer point of view?
Well, I think as business digests these raft of technical notices, I think it becomes clear that this is the biggest logistical challenge that we faced in peacetime. So there's an enormous amount for us to do. In our industry, however, there's an overriding objective, which is to ensure we can get our medicines to patients. And today, the government has done some things which really help us to do that. Batch testing might sound very technical. Actually, what it means is we don't have to duplicate clinical testing laboratories, which would have been very challenging for us to set up. So that makes a big difference for us. We're used to having buffer stocks. We can never afford to run out of medicines, so we carry buffer stocks anyway. What the government's done today is given us advice about how long we might need to increase those stocks, recognising there'll be challenges at the border. So
just quickly follow up, the buffer stocks,
Yeah.
Are they paid for by the industry or by the taxpayer, by the government?
Well, I think the government has left that open to further discussion. I think the government will need to put their hand into their pocket, because there's a huge amount that they're asking to do. And the more they help, the more they'll reduce the risk to patients. So I think they need to step forward.
John De Beer, pretty unambiguous today in the financial services paper. Passporting is over. What does that mean for companies, say, selling insurance to people in France or Italy or Slovenia or wherever? I mean, do those policies just suddenly disappear the day after this happens, if it happens?
As you say, when the UK leaves the EU, insurers will lose the ability to sell policies across border. Now, whilst that is challenging for the future and selling new business into the EU, it's far more challenging for all those contracts that were sold prior to Brexit.
What sort of numbers?
So the Bank of England estimates that there's around 38 million insurance contracts, around 55 billion pounds worth rather, which is a lot of customers who are left in legal limbo from this decision.
Okay, let's ask Helen Browning as well. Same question in a way, Helen. 218 days. Obviously, agriculture, you've got to look a fair way down the line. Is this doable for you?
I think today's announcements really hammer home just how difficult a no deal would be for agriculture and food. It seems vital to me that we stay in the customs union, or as aligned as we possibly can do to EU standards. It's a huge challenge, as you said earlier on. It's a challenge for all of agriculture, but there are particular difficulties for organic. And it could leave us in a situation where we are unable to trade for up to 9 months, and that would be devastating for our industry.
Can you, at this point, search either for other markets, or, I mean, to put it crudely, go non-organic, or is that just not the way your business works?
Well, I think it does. As a farmer myself, we're having to face up to some really difficult decisions. How do you face this when it's government still saying they're going to do a deal? This feels a bit like a game of chicken to me. And we have to decide, do we invest in trying to find new markets for organic produce here? Often it's cuts and bits of the carcass, of the pig carcass, that we don't want to eat in this country. Or do we reduce production? And yet, if we do all of those things and really mess our businesses around, and then there is a deal, we feel even more stupid. So I think it's very hard for farmers and food businesses to know how to invest now, to know what steps to take. And for small rural businesses, the cost of doing this and making contingencies for all these eventualities is really burdensome. So I think it puts us in a very difficult position. I really hope we can make progress very quickly on this now.
Mike Thompson, just turning back to the pharmaceutical industry here for a moment. I mean, you've given a guarded welcome to this. You've said it can work with the recognition of batch testing. How far does this require the EU 27 to behave cooperatively? Or is this an absolutely watertight standalone solution if indeed everybody says they don't want it, but if it comes to that?
Well, our priority is patients, and patients are the same on the continent as they are here. Actually, we need the EU to be doing the same sort of thing that the UK is doing to help us ensure we can deliver to EU patients. So I think that's the first thing that's important. The second thing
do you
is,
sense they are doing that?
So not at the moment.
Right.
So actually the UK is ahead. British patients are being more protected by the UK government than actually the other member states are doing for their patients. So I think this is a call out to other member states to say, you need to get planning too. But I'd agree with Helen that at the end of the day, what we're looking for is not a no-deal solution, as the Secretary of State said. We're looking for a deal.
That's what everyone.
It's clear that a deal, which in our case would be medicines cooperation, is the right outcome.
John de Beer, let's talk about the issue of pensioners, Spain, France, wherever. Can you craft a solution for them in time if this does come to no deal? And how far is it possible, for example, bilaterally with the Spanish, French governments to come to a solution that will allow them to continue receiving pensions?
The problem is not intractable. The pensioners do form part of that 38 million contracts that I said before. But the UK government has already shown willing here and is willing to pass temporary legislation to protect policyholders in the UK of EU companies. So the reciprocal decision can be taken by the EU Commission or European authorities to protect EU citizens or UK expats living in the EU. At the moment, that decision is not forthcoming, and the Commission have said that companies have to look to private solutions. But yes, bilateral solutions are also possible. It's within the gift of each individual member state to decide how insurance companies are authorised to provide services, pay claims, pay out customers in their markets.
Helen Browning, maybe a final word from you, if we may. It does say in the paper that they're going to try and work through a solution on this 9-month issue of applying for certification for your organic produce. I mean, are you at all optimistic? Have your contacts with governments so far led you to believe they've got the grip necessary to get this through?
Well, I get the impression, working with DEFRA, the department that's really trying to pursue this, that they are making great efforts to try and get these arrangements in place. But there doesn't seem to be much progress yet. And the notice today really doesn't give us any certainty at all. It poses the questions, it poses the problems, but it doesn't give us the solutions. And we really do need that certainty in business if we're not going to go severely backwards.
Thank you so much for that. Clearly, many rivers still to cross. Helen Browning, Mike Thompson, John de Beer, thank you all for giving us your insights. Well, we wanted to speak to someone from the government today, but there was nobody available. We were keen to hear from the Labour Party too, but they told us that there was no one available from their side either. Here's what Shadow Brexit Secretary Keir Starmer had to say earlier today.
I think what ran through the speech really was a vagueness about what the government was really saying, but also this, that in a number of respects, what the government was really saying is, in the event of no deal, we'll just have to keep on talking to the EU to find a way forward. And in many ways, that underlines the point that we've been making all along, which is that no deal is not viable, because in the end, the government is saying, we'll just have to talk it through if we get to that position.
Well, let's talk through the politics of this now and how it might play out in the Conservative government in the coming weeks. We're joined by Jacob Rees-Mogg, Chair of the European Research Group, Brexit supporting Tory MPs, of course, and Sarah Wollaston, Chair of the Health Select Committee, who's joining us from Exeter and who backed Remain. Sarah Wollaston, if I can start with you. Mr Rees-Mogg has sent this letter to Conservative associations saying they should chuck Chequers. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's really disappointing, and particularly considering the ERG effectively tabled motions that would critically undermine the deal in any case, and are now doing so direct to associations and to Conservative colleagues. And what Jacob needs to do is look at the technical notices that have been published today, and this is just the first tranche, because they set out the sheer scale of the complexity that is going to be unleashed and all the unintended consequences and problems that will come with it. And we absolutely have to avoid a no deal if we possibly can.
Well, you penned that letter, you've tried to influence the debate clearly, but you've also heard from the experts earlier in the programme. Are you not making a no-deal Brexit more likely by the action you took in writing to associations, making compromise within the party harder?
No, I think the compromise within the party was set out by the Prime Minister at the Mansion House speech, and that was something that both sides of the party were willing to accept and the country was willing to accept. The problem with Chequers is that it means not leaving the European Union, remaining subject to the European Union's rulebook and therefore de facto to the European Court of Justice. What many people in my position would like to see is a Canada plus free trade deal with the European Union, which would solve most of the issues that have been raised with these notices.
Would it get through Parliament, though?
Well, it'd be very likely to, because it would depend what the alternative was. If the alternative was leaving without any deal other than WTO terms, then a free trade deal would be very attractive to many members of Parliament, much more so than Chequers. Chequers probably would have a harder time getting through Parliament than a Canada-style trade deal.
But right now you've got a soft deal, Labour Party, effectively a soft Brexit, and you've got a wing within your own party that would go for that. I mean, I'm just wondering the degree to which you might see it as advantageous to precipitate a no-deal situation.
I think a free trade deal can be achieved, but that leaving on WTO terms is not as absurdly frightening as the Chancellor of the Exchequer thinks it may be.
Well, the CBI today said that people who talk about trading on WTO terms are not living in the real world. That's you, I suppose they're talking about.
The CBI's record is even worse than the Treasury's. The CBI thought we should join the ERM, it thought we should join the Euro, and it didn't want us to vote to leave.
One imagines they're representing their members' views
by their record. And the CBI has very few members. It's got lots of people beyond its strict membership who pay for it. You've got to be careful on how you describe membership of the CBI. But what the Chancellor was saying is from an organisation that predicted on a vote to leave, we faced a collapse in the economy of at least 3.6% and probably 6%, with an increase of unemployment between 500 and 800,000. The Treasury's Brexit panic means that you can no longer trust the Treasury's forecast, which is actually why George Osborne set up the Office of Budget Responsibility in the first place, because he said as Chancellor that we need independent forecasters who we can trust.
I want to go back to Sarah Wollaston in a moment, but just before I do, it's clear in your letter, and you've said it tonight, that you prefer the Canada-style package to so-called no-deal or WTO
terms.
WTO terms. But if the choice is WTO terms or Chequers...
Oh, WTO terms are much better because we've actually left the European Union and we can flourish in that way. And if you look at what's come out today, you had a discussion in David Grossman's package about importing regulations. Those would be set by the British government, and the British government could deregulate and make things much easier for importers from all around the world, not just from the European Union, and that they haven't looked to in these papers today.
Sarah Wollaston, do you find any of that reassuring? I mean...
Not at all. I think it's really, really worrying. This is about far more than tariffs and trade deals. This is about complex networks that have been set up over 40 years, and it's about the non-tariff barriers as well. And I'm just thinking of the number of businesses I've visited in my constituency over the recess. Everything from language schools, for example, who are desperately worried about the impact of the loss of Erasmus, for example, and their partners are already moving to sort of partner up with businesses in the Republic of Ireland. And I'm also thinking about businesses, for example, who export and import from Europe, medium-sized businesses for whom this is going to cause catastrophic costs and complexity, particularly those who are dealing in high, sort of small volumes but of many different product lines. They are deeply worried about the impact of this, and it's about the non-tariff barriers in particular.
With your health committee hat on, and I don't know if you heard what Mike Thompson from the pharmaceutical industry said earlier.
Yes, I did.
Are you reassured in the way he is, or do you have greater concerns than he seems?
Well, of course, he's not, I wouldn't say he's exactly completely reassured. What we're all welcoming is that the government is starting to properly plan for this, because again, without planning, if we crash out with no deal and no transition, and the government weren't planning for this properly, we would end up with critical shortages. But what I would say is that a lot of the things they're talking about extra warehousing, 6 weeks additional storage capacity, air freighting in of products that can't be, that can't be stored because they have a very short shelf life, things like medical radioisotopes. All of that has a very significant cost attached.
Yes,
and
indeed.
those costs ultimately will be passed on to the NHS and to all of us as taxpayers.
Forgive me.
So we need to know exactly what the cost of this is.
Forgive me, we're nearly out of time. I'm sorry to interrupt. There's just one more question I want to ask before we leave this. There's clearly going to be a political fight when people come back from the recess. A lot of people talking about a possible leadership competition. Aaron Banks says he's joined the Conservative Party, seems to be wanting to bring lots of EU people in with him. Do you welcome that?
I would like to see the party back to having the 2 million members it used to have.
And one of them is Aaron Banks.
But hold on, I think the party is entitled to be cautious about people joining from other parties. Sometimes it's a great success. I think Chris Grayling, the very distinguished Transport Secretary, was a member of the SDP many years ago, and sometimes that's fine. But the Conservative Party should always, and all parties should be cautious of entryism. It's not beneficial.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, Sarah Wilson, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us.